In the year 40 BC, twins would be born to Queen Cleopatra of Egypt and Roman general Mark Antony. One a boy, the other a girl, one named Sun, the other Moon. This is the story of Cleopatra Selene, the Moon Queen of Mauritania. The early life of Cleopatra Selene II was a turbulent one. Her twin brother's full name was Alexander Helios. She had one older half-brother, the only son of Julius Caesar and Queen Cleopatra of Egypt. His name was Caesarion Ptolemy XV Caesar. 4 years before the birth of the celestial twins, their half-brother's father would be assassinated in Rome on the Ides of March 14th of 44 BC. The twins were born after the queen invited Mark Antony to her capital at Alexandria in 41 BC. On the grounds of a diplomatic mission, they both needed an ally. That they found in each other, and a whole lot more. Antony, like his friend Caesar, would end up spending a lot of time with Cleopatra. He left Alexandria after spending the winter with her. The next fall, she gave birth to their children. Antony had now cheated on the sister of his rival, Octavian, and soon, he would even leave her for the Egyptian queen. Mark Antony for the next 2 years would be campaigning in Rome as well as around the Levant area. He would return to Cleopatra, Caesarion, and his 2 twin children in 37 BC. Antony would soon be forced to leave Alexandria again after a short stay. Again, he left the queen pregnant, this time with only a single child. His name was Ptolemy XVI Philadelphus, and he was born in the summer of 36 BC. In that same year of 36 BC, Antony and Cleopatra would conduct a diplomatic ceremony in Antioch. It would come to be called the Donations of Antioch, and it would grant land to both Antony and Cleopatra. It would even be officially recognized by Octavian back in Rome. 2 years after this, a similarly named, but less well received, Donations of Alexandria would take place. In the fall of 34 BC, Cleopatra and Caesarion would receive Egypt. Caesarion was officially named as Julius Caesar's legitimate son. The infant Ptolemy XVI Philadelphus was granted the provinces of Syria, Cilicia, and Phoenicia along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Alexander Helios was granted Armenia and the Parthian Empire, if his father could ever conquer it. For Cleopatra Selene, she would be granted Cyrenaica and Libya, which at that time was land that was part of Roman Numidia. These donations would all be rejected by Octavian. All but one, that is. The last day of peace between Antony and Octavian would be the last day of 33 BC. Octavian and Mark Antony would go to war in that following year. Later in 31 BC, the fleets of these two men would meet just off the coast of Greece. The battle that ensued, which would become called Actium, would see the much smaller and more maneuverable boats commanded by Agricola defeat the combined navies of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. The couple would retreat back to Alexandria. Later in 30 BC, the campaigns of Octavian would continue as he invaded Egypt. Mark Antony, having heard of Cleopatra's suicide, killed himself, plunging a gladius into his stomach. However, Cleopatra had not killed herself. The bleeding out Antony was then brought to the queen. He would soon die in her arms. With his death, Cleopatra fulfilled her end of their deal, killing herself with the bite of a poisonous snake on August 10th. This would leave her 4 children all orphans, and leaving one in immediate and grave danger. Cleopatra Selene's older half-brother Caesarion would flee south, but would return to Alexandria after Octavian sent a letter ensuring his safety. Caesarion would be tricked, arrested, and executed by Octavian. While Octavian knew exactly what to do with Caesarion, the children of Antony and Cleopatra would be a question all in itself. Ptolemy Philadelphus was only 6, the twins only 10 when they entered into Octavian's captivity. Octavian would return to Rome and be granted a triumph. In the victory parade was the 3 orphan children in bulky chains that Ptolemy Philadelphus could barely hold up. After this triumph, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus are never heard from again. Octavian claims that he did not kill them, but if he did not, then Octavian would be making an out-of-character diplomatic mistake. Personally, I think Octavian either executed or poisoned the sons of his rival, but for some reason, he kept Cleopatra Selene alive. She was now the last Ptolemy. The fate of her dynasty now rested in her hands alone. The Ptolemaic homeland of Egypt would be annexed by the Roman Republic. The orphan Cleopatra Selene would be raised in the same household as her other half-siblings. This would, of course, mean that Cleopatra was now in the care of Octavia, the sister of Octavian, otherwise known as the wife that Mark Antony left in order to be with the Egyptian queen. Imagine that, raising the child of your dead husband's baby that he had while cheating on you. She would grow up in the city of Rome with the protection granted to her by being under the care of Octavian's sister. Cleopatra Selene was near untouchable. When Octavian declared the Roman Empire in January of 27 BC and declared himself emperor and Augustus, Cleopatra Selene's situation would improve even more. She would continue living in Rome, joining the court of the first Roman emperor. By the summer of 27 BC, Selene turned 18. Augustus began looking for a political marriage for this daughter of a rival, turned something of a niece. The last Ptolemy as a wife, and the legitimacy that her family name provided, would be a gift of great value to any Roman noble or any foreign king. By 25 BC, a marriage had been arranged with Juba II, a king and longtime friend and ally of Augustus. King Juba was someone who Augustus trusted enough to give the power of the entire legacy of the Ptolemaic dynasty and trust him not to use that power against him. Juba had been installed as king of Numidia by Octavian in 30 BC, right before the slaughter of his now wife's family. In case his friend needed any more convincing, Augustus also brought to the wedding a large dowry. Juba II was the son of Juba I, who in 46 BC killed himself. This would result in Numidia being annexed as a province in the Roman Republic for the next 16 years until Juba II came of age. Juba II was only 18 when he came to the throne, and only 23 when he married the 20-year-old Cleopatra Selene. The young couple was set to rule Numidia for a very long time. Except, they didn't. Well, not eastern Numidia, that is. In another shrewd political move by Augustus, he annexes the eastern portion of Numidia into the Roman province of Africa Proconsulares. Just as the emperor seemingly gave Cleopatra Selene the province of Libya, which was promised to her by her father and mother at the donations of Alexandria, he took it away from her, showing who was really in control of the Mediterranean. For western Numidia, Juba and Selene would get to keep that. To repay for the couple's lost land, they were granted the kingship of neighboring Mauritania. Mauritania, since 33 BC, had been incorporated as a Roman province. Now, it was united with West Numidia. The last pieces of North Africa, not directly owned by Rome, was the Kingdom of Mauritania. Their new capital would be renamed Caesarea, in honor of who else but Julius Caesar. King Juba II allowed his queen much control over Mauritania. The kingdom was hers as much as it was his. Queen Cleopatra Selene went to work on improving Mauritania's economic situation. Although they had more land as monarchs of Mauritania, this new land was less developed and poorly organized. To assist her kingdom, the Moon Queen invited some of the old friends of her mother. Selene invited capable architects, advisors, artists, and diplomats that had once served her mother when she was the Queen of Egypt. If Selene was going to be shoved into the opposite side of Africa from her Egyptian homeland, then she would just bring Egypt to Mauritania. The same people who had helped to build Cleopatra's Egypt would also build the Moon Queen's Mauritania. Their capital of Caesarea had at this point been mostly built in the Roman style. This architecture would remain, but accompanying this architecture was a new style to the region that had not previously been seen. The construction of Egyptian-style temples would start to spring up in Caesarea, as well as in the rest of Mauritania. Inside, they would depict the gods of the Romans alongside their Egyptian counterparts. On the seafront of Caesarea, a palace similar to the one that she grew up in Egypt was constructed. If this didn't already mark the land as a Ptolemaic monument, then the Queen's next building project certainly would. If you had to connect one building to the Ptolemy dynasty, what would it be? Located in Alexandria, Egypt, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, I am of course talking about the Lighthouse of Alexandria. This ancient lighthouse was reconstructed in the capital of Caesarea. Juba II and Cleopatra Selene's capital, perhaps better than any other city, represented the many cultures of the Mediterranean. Roman, Egyptian, Hellenistic, Punic, and Berber architecture and people could all be found in Caesarea. King Juba II was himself a historian and scholar. It only made sense that he would allow for his queen to reconstruct her Ptolemaic homeland. This would understandably draw a lot of attention to this corner of the Mediterranean. Merchants flocked from all over to have a look at Egypt incarnate. Trade with Italy at their capital of Caesarea flourished. Meanwhile, at the Straits of Gibraltar, trade with Spain found its way into Mauritania. Predominantly, the Mauritanians themselves traded ores, figs, large amounts of grain, ornate furniture, as well as the highly sought-after purple dye. Not only did trade prosper under the couple, but so too did exploration. An expedition force gathered, intent on finding land past the Pillars of Hercules. Instead of sticking to the European or African coast, this expedition went straight into the endless Atlantic Ocean. They first made landfall on Madeira. Continuing south, they stumbled upon an archipelago. They made landfall on the largest island called Tenerife. On this island, they found no humans, but only the traces of them. The expedition force stumbled upon a large stone temple, but could not find any of the local Guanche inhabitants. Archaeology shows that the Guanches were already living there, but were probably hiding from the maritime expedition. One thing they did find was man's best friend, the dog. Apparently the dogs on Tenerife were so vicious and numerous that when King Juba was told, he named the archipelago in honor of them. The Canary Islands, from the Latin canis, which means dog. It is also said that when the power couple reigned in Mauritania, the purity and quality of their coins, both silver and gold, were comparable, and sometimes even better than the Roman ones. In 10 BC, the last Ptolemy, Cleopatra Selene, became one of 2 Ptolemies. Her son would be born. He would be known as Ptolemy, the future king of Mauritania, and the last Ptolemy monarch ever. But for now, he was just an infant. This baby was joined shortly after his birth by a sister. Her name was likely Drusilla, but no evidence past her own existence has survived. In 7 AD, King Juba II would marry Princess Glypheria of Cappadocia. Glypheria had been married to the Prince of Judea, Alexander Herod, but he was executed by his father after a conspiracy. Glypheria was then sent back to Cappadocia. In 2 AD, King Juba II went on a tour of the eastern Mediterranean, where he likely met Princess Glypheria. The two must have hit it off, as by 7 AD they marry, despite Cleopatra Selene still being alive. Juba could have either divorced Cleopatra to marry Glypheria, or he simply just had 2 wives. The marriage wouldn't even last a year until Glypheria left and divorced Juba for her dead husband's brother. This was the only brief interruption over the course of their long reigns. With Cleopatra Selene as the sole queen of Mauritania, the couple lived out a peaceful existence. The Moon Queen's death date is unknown, but coins minted in her honor have been dated to 17 AD, leaving this as the earliest possible date for her death. The latest year that she could have died was 22 AD, as her husband, who died a year later, would outlive the queen. When she died, Juba II had erected a giant monument which would act as their final resting place, called the Royal Mausoleum of Mauritania. It still stands to this day, although the body of Cleopatra Selene is nowhere to be found. In 23 AD, King Juba II would also die, and be buried next to his queen. Succeeding them both would be their son, Ptolemy. The Moon Queen of Mauritania, the far less recognized Queen Cleopatra, represented a lot of different things. For one, she solely represented her Ptolemaic dynasty. With the death of her twin brother, Alexander Helios, the sun had set on the powerful Ptolemies. Now all that remained was the light of the moon. Soon that too would fade away into darkness. Many queens in Armenian history have shown that they are just as competent, if not more than their kingly counterparts. Perhaps no one else stands as tall among these strong female rulers more than Urartu Artaxiad, the last of her dynasty and the 3-time queen of Armenia. Her story is one of repeated rise and fall that ultimately saw her become the national pride of a country that only wanted to rip itself apart. Urartu started life as a princess, being born to the Armenian king, Tigran III, sometime around 20 BC. Her mother's name remains a mystery, although we do know that she was the second of Tigran's 2 wives. Shortly before the birth of Urartu, the king's first wife gave birth to her slightly older half-brother, taking his father's name of Tigran. The 2 royal children were brought up in ancient Armenia's capital city of Artaxata. Here, they would have received a royal education consisting of Hellenistic and Armenian studies that would have primed them for their future roles as monarchs. Over the course of their childhood, Armenia was in a state of complete peace, in contrast to the decades previous where external chaos had plagued the nation. Their father, Tigran III, was a just ruler who was loved by his people. Well, most of them. But that problem would fall to his children as Tigran III died a young man in 8 BC, leaving 2 adolescents at the head of an Armenia that was ready to erupt. In a normal Artaxiad enthronement, the first to become king was the eldest son of that previous king, but this was no normal succession. For starters, the siblings weren't even adults yet. For conclusions, they were both the last 2 members of the main Artaxiad dynasty that had ruled Armenia for nearly 200 years. Together, these 2 things would lead to the marriage of the royal half-siblings. This is, of course, incest and is terribly frowned upon today, but for the ancient world of the Middle East, this was not out of the ordinary. Keeping the royal blood pure was a top priority in antiquity. It's unknown if they were married before their rise to monarchy, but it was likely something that was already planned in the life of Tigran III. Most Armenians were elated that they had not only 1, but 2 Artaxiads ruling over them. Their marriage symbolized the continued peace and prosperity that Armenia had enjoyed during the reign of their father. Tigran IV and Urartu are unique in the way that they were equals. She was an autocrat in the same way that her brother was, and on both of their council, they would rule Armenia. However, at the point of their coronation in 8 BC, the siblings were too young to rule without a regency. This could have fallen to a council of nobles, or perhaps one or both mothers of the dual monarchs. Much like the monarchy, Armenia was split in quite a few ways. Firstly, their country had been split between their 2 largest neighbors, Rome and Parthia, ever since the final years of Tigran the Great some 50 years ago. The 2 great powers tussled for the vassalization of the Artaxiads. However, at this point, Augustus had been the overlord of Armenia since Tigran III came to power in 20 BC. This external power jockeying caused a crisis of character for the Armenian people. The nobility was split on who they favored, with pro-Parthian and pro-Roman factions emerging as adversaries. Even still, there was a persistence among the common folk to secure the independence of Armenia. This would have been nearly impossible at this time, but the rising Armenian nationalist group was perhaps too proud to think otherwise. While the enthronement of Urartu and Tigran was well received in Armenia, the same cannot be said in Rome. For Augustus, his Armenian subjects had chosen their rulers without his permission. This wouldn't have been a problem, but the half-siblings were not Augustus's picks for the throne. Although they were the last remaining members of the main Artaxiad branch, they were not the only contenders. Sitting in Rome, patiently waiting for his turn, was a man named Artavasdes. Not much is known about Artavasdes. We don't even know who his parents were, but we do know that he was a member of the Armenian royal family, likely a cousin of the sibling monarchs. My theory of Artavasdes' origins plants him as a descendant of Tigran the Great's younger brother, Guras, although any evidence corroborating this does not exist. Another, perhaps more believable theory is that his mother was an Artaxiad princess who was given to Augustus that he promptly married to one of his allies. Enthroning Artavasdes would be a surefire bet. As far as we can tell, he was likely raised in Rome and around the emperor himself, making him a valuable ally if he was to become the Armenian king. Artavasdes as king would also split the Artaxiad family, and split Armenia further than it already was. This would benefit Rome, as keeping the Artaxiads weak would leave them to become ever more powerless and ensure continued cooperation with the Roman Empire. Removing 2 monarchs and handpicking one would have also been a power play by Augustus, showing who was really in charge. While Augustus preferred Artavasdes as king, the matter was put aside for the time, as Aratu and Tigranes IV proved to be nothing less than loyal. They sent gifts to the Eternal City and its emperor, showing that they were more than willing to continue the status quo. For 3 years, the siblings continued ruling Armenia as a peaceful Roman vassal. In 5 BC, Augustus finally got around to the Armenian question. As Armenia grew stronger under their continued peace, it soon became a threat at the frontier of the Roman Empire. Worried that Armenia may split from Rome and side with Parthia once more, Augustus took the initiative and sent his Artaxiad puppet, Artavasdes, to the court of Artaxata. It's unknown if Augustus sent Artavasdes with an army or simply diplomats, but the result would be all the same. Aratu and Tigranes IV were overthrown, and a new sole king of Armenia was crowned in 5 BC, in the form of Artavasdes III. And just as all deposed Artaxiads do, they turned to the enemy of their enemy for aid. This time, it was the Parthian Empire. King Artavasdes III proved to be an unpopular pick among the Armenians. Where the Roman, Parthian, and Armenian factions were satisfied with the sibling monarchs, only the pro-Roman party were pleased with Augustus's pick. A note should be made here on the coinage of Artavasdes III. The new king's coins echoed Roman influence. Artavasdes is depicted less like an Armenian king and more like a Roman emperor. Of course, he still sported the double eagle crown, but his facial features looked more Latin than Artaxiad. This may have been the truth of his face, but these coins represented the attempted Romanization of Armenia. While Artavasdes III minted his coins, the usurped monarchs found themselves in the court of Phraates IV, Emperor of Parthia. At this point in 5 BC, Phraates had ruled Parthia for the last 32 years as both Mark Antony and Augustus's most powerful rival. The Parthian emperor even assisted Aratu and Tigranes' uncle, Artaxerxes II, to reclaim his throne. In his early years, Phraates would jump on any opportunity to oppose Roman influence, but as the empire became ever more consolidated and powerful under Augustus, Phraates became more reluctant to avoid a total war with Rome. Instead of directly supporting the deposed monarchs with an army, Phraates took a more subtle approach. The Parthian emperor monetarily supported Aratu and Tigranes, who would use this money to bribe more members of the pro-Parthian faction onto their side. After 3 years of exile in Parthia, the dual monarchs, now of age to rule Armenia without the need of a regent, were ready to make their return. In 2 BC, likely at the head of an army, Tigranes and Aratu overthrew their cousin and reclaimed their throne. Artavasdes III had failed to win over the Armenians, as his 3-year reign was mostly spent in the palace. The deposed king would therefore be exiled, where he likely returned to a displeased Augustus in Rome. Following this, Artavasdes' fate is unknown, as he disappeared from the historical record. With their throne reclaimed, Phraates IV, not wanting to start another war with Rome, withdrew all Parthian support for Armenia. This was one of his final actions, as he would die soon after the siblings reclaimed their seat of power. Aratu and Tigranes IV had just forcefully overthrown a Roman ally. They were now in threat of triggering a war with the hegemon of the Mediterranean. Instead of declaring independence as one might expect, the siblings wrote to Augustus, sending gifts and pledging their continued support as a vassal of the Roman Empire. Reluctantly, Augustus agreed to support the otherwise loyal monarchs. With Urartu and Tigran reclaiming their thrones at the head of an army, the 18-year streak of peace in Armenia was finally shattered. This would prove to be the breaking point for the growing factionalism that had consumed Armenia over that time. The pro-Parthian party that helped Urartu and Tigran reclaim their throne were disgruntled with their continued support for Rome. In the east, they gathered an army, intent on opposing Augustus and the Artaxiad siblings. Tigran IV, now an adult, assembled his own army and rode to confront his old allies. The young king of Armenia, who had grown up in utter peace, was inexperienced in the art of war, while the pro-Parthian faction of nobles had been trading blows with Rome for decades. In 1 AD, the armies would clash in a battle that would decide the fate of Armenia. There are no records about this engagement or where it even took place, but the result would see the 20-year-old Tigran IV defeated and dead. With half of the twin monarchy gone, Tigran left an even younger Urartu, widowed and alone, all while she still carried their unborn child. As the army that had killed the king approached Artaxata, Urartu gave no resistance and willingly abdicated her throne. Hereafter, the pregnant queen likely made her way to Rome, possibly reuniting with her cousin, Artaxerxes III, who probably found amusement in seeing the queen who had exiled him be exiled herself. Sometime during or after the long journey to Rome, Urartu gave birth to a daughter. Unfortunately, her name has been lost, but this baby was the last to ever be born as a true Artaxiad. Although we don't know her name, we do know who this child eventually married. She would wed the king of Iberia, Pharasmenes, a land neighboring Armenia that the Artaxiad had once ruled over themselves. The couple would go on to have 3 sons, with the eldest of these 3 children, Radamistus, proving to be a psychotic ruler who would invade and subject Armenia to his cruel reign. I made a video about him linked here, if you'd like to check that out. Now, back to the story at hand. With Queen Urartu exiled and King Tigran IV dead, the pro-Parthian faction emerged at the head of a kingless Armenia. The new council of ruling nobles wrote to Parthia, seeking their overlordship as planned. However, with the Roman Empire on the rise, Parthia's days of defeating legions was numbered. The Armenians found no support from the Parthians that they had just fought a war over. Augustus was still very much so in charge. He just needed to find a ruler that all Armenians would be happy to call their king. To compromise with the pro-Parthian faction, Augustus appointed the neighboring ruler of Atropatene, Ariobarzanes II, as the king of Armenia. Ariobarzanes was likely a distant relative of the Artaxiads, but most importantly, he was also related to the Arsacid dynasty of kings that ruled over the Parthian Empire. Having someone who could claim descent from Armenia and Parthia would surely quell the situation. What Augustus had failed to calculate was the long memory of the Armenians. Since the reign of Tigran the Great, Armenia and Atropatene were sworn enemies. Even the suggestion of this enthronement was enough for the splintered Armenian factions to find common ground and unite. Together, they weren't just fighting for Rome or Parthia, but for the independence of Armenia itself, finding a strong leader in the form of an inspiring general named Abaddon. Seeing that the Armenians were less than willing to give up their independence for the first time in 60 years, Augustus sent an army in the direction of Armenia. These legions were led by one of the many heirs of Augustus, his grandson, Gaius Caesar. With their armies combined, Ariobarzanes of Atropatene and Gaius Caesar marched into a hostile Armenia. The rebel stronghold was a city in the far east named Artagira, but before reaching the city, the pair first had to contend with the guerrilla warriors in the mountains of the Lesser Caucasus. This they did in good time, reaching Artagira sometime in 2 AD. A siege would ensue for some time before Abaddon finally decided to give up his fight. Running low on provisions, he invited Gaius Caesar into his stronghold to discuss peace. Sometime after entering the fort, with his bodyguard in tow, Abaddon made the signal, and the Armenians closed the gates, pouncing on the Romans. Gaius Caesar was wounded in the brief engagement that ended with his small retinue fighting their way out of the fort, carrying their general out of Artagira with them. Gaius survived the ambush and returned to his camp. Handing command to one of his officers, he ordered for the siege to continue. After a bloody fight, the Romans took Artagira soon after. Showing no mercy after Abaddon's treachery, they killed him and every Armenian nationalist inside. With their leader dead, the task of pacifying Armenia was relatively easy, and complete by 3 AD. With Rome firmly in control of Armenia, Ariobarzanes was formally crowned as king. Showing his dominance over the nationalists, he made his capital of both kingdoms at the city of Artagira. Concluding the Armenian campaign, Gaius Caesar began his journey back to Rome, but he would never lay eyes on the city again. His wound was more serious than anticipated, and he died in the early days of 4 AD, one of the many heirs of Augustus who died before his time. The Armenians may have lost the war, but they would get the last laugh. This time, the next time, and even the time after that. While the Armenian nationalists had been defeated, they were not yet subdued, going into hiding in the mountains, or simply in plain sight. In 4 AD, after only a year of ruling Armenia, King Ariobarzanes was assassinated by them. His succession was followed by his son, a man named Artavasdes, the fourth king of his name to rule in Armenia, and the second of his name in Atropatene. This, however, only served to raise the nationalist fervor, and just like his father, he was assassinated in 6 AD, only ruling for 2 years. For Atropatene, this was the last king that they could give to the Romans. Shortly after the assassination of Artavasdes, a tribe of nomads known as the Dahe took the opportunity to conquer Atropatene, and named their leader, Artabanus, as the new king. With a dead grandson, 2 exiled monarchs, and 2 dead kings, Augustus finally relented. At this point, he had little other options than to compromise with the Armenian nationalists. He knew that if he wanted to keep Armenia as a vassal, then he needed to let them be ruled by one of their own. Or perhaps, 2 of their own. Augustus picked the new king of Armenia, a man unsurprisingly named Tigran, the 5th of his name to rule Armenia. Tigran was a member of the Jewish Herodian dynasty, his grandfather being King Herod himself. Tigran's grandmother was an Artaxiad princess and the daughter of King Artavasdes II of Armenia. Tigran V was born in 16 BC and raised in Herodian Jerusalem. When Tigran was only 9, his father, the future king of Judea, Alexander Herod, was assassinated on the orders of his own father, Herod the Great. Hereafter, Tigran would remain in Jerusalem, bearing witness to his grandfather's growing paranoia, especially in regard to a baby born in Bethlehem. When King Herod died, Tigran left Judea and made way to the court of his other grandfather, King Archelaus of Cappadocia. Finally free of Herod's captivity, Tigran despised him so much that he renounced his Jewish religion and chose to embrace his Hellenistic roots, an Armenian name. He remained in Cappadocia for some time until he was sent to Rome for education, thus leaving another Armenian heir in the palms of Augustus. Following the death of both Atropatene kings in 6 AD, Augustus sent Tigran to Armenia along with an army and another one of his heirs, this one being the future emperor, Tiberius. On the way to Armenia, the Roman army made a pit stop in Cappadocia to pick up King Archelaus, who would accompany his grandson to Armenia. The Armenian nationalists finally put down their weapons, as a descendant and namesake of Tigran the Great was once again ruling over them. Tigran V was escorted to Artaxata, which he renamed as the capital. Soon after, he was crowned as the king of Armenia. The nationalists were finally happy with Augustus's pick, but they were not wholly satisfied. While Tigran had Artaxiad blood in his veins, he was a Herodian by birth. The Armenians agreed to accept Tigran V, but only if he reigned side by side with the true Artaxiad queen, Urartu. Urartu made her way from Rome and joined Tigran V at Artaxata, where, for the third time in her life, she was named as the Queen of Armenia. While there is no evidence that Tigran V and Urartu married, they most likely did, to appease the Armenian people. Armenia was once again ruled over by a King Tigran and the same Queen Urartu. With this, the nationalist revolt stopped, and Armenia returned to the long peace that was enjoyed during the Queen's first reign. As before, the dual monarchs held equal power in their kingdom. However, it appeared that Urartu took the driver's seat in their shared rule. After all, Tigran V had never set foot in Armenia before this time. Queen Urartu did her best to restore the prosperity Armenia had enjoyed during her childhood. She was a patron of the arts and funded the reconstruction of many of the buildings and temples that were destroyed during the years of chaos. The coins issued during her third reign would feature the beautiful Urartu on one side, with the dual peaks of Mount Ararat on the other. These twin peaks are the most important mountains in Armenian history, holding a cultural significance even before they became synonymous with the proposed landing place of Noah's Ark. The two mountaintops also represented the dual reign of the Armenian monarchs. These coins are a stark contrast to the coins of Artaxerxes III, who issued his in a more Roman fashion. This helped maintain the Armenian culture, even when under a Roman overlord. During her third reign, Queen Urartu's biggest contribution was her simple existence. As long as she was queen, peace could be maintained. She was somebody that Rome and Parthia could respect, but most importantly, she was loved by her people. While Armenia was undergoing a period of healing, trouble was brewing in the east. In 12 AD, the king of Atropatene, Artabanus, invaded Parthia and became their new emperor. The deposed Parthian king, Vonones, had little option left of where to continue his resistance. He wisely chose a land where Atropatene was public enemy number one. This was, of course, Armenia. In 12 AD, Vonones entered Armenia and overthrew Tigran and Urartu, sending the queen into her third and final exile from her homeland. After 6 years of rule, the age of Tigran V and Queen Urartu was over. Tigran likely returned to his grandfather's court in Cappadocia, where he lived for many years until he fell victim to the paranoia of the man who had brought him to Armenia in the first place, the now emperor, Tiberius. As for Urartu, her life after 12 AD is a mystery. But I'd like to think she joined her daughter in the kingdom of Iberia, where she instilled within her eldest grandson, Radamistus, an undying urge to retake Armenia for their family, at all cost. Queen Urartu's 3 separate reigns represented the bleak future ahead of Armenia. As Romans and Parthians fought over her homeland, they would continue doing so for the next 50 years, as Armenia became a battleground between the two burgeoning empires. The last Artaxiad to rule Armenia would also happen to be the only queen to ever rule Armenia as a true monarch. This, in itself, should be celebrated. The 200-year reign of the Artaxiad dynasty was a golden age, that gave rise to some of classical Armenia's greatest rulers. From its founder, Artaxias, who quite literally set ancient Armenia's boundaries in stone pillars, to his grandson Tigran the Great, who pushed far past those pillars and led Armenia into empire, where its territorial zenith would never come close to being matched. While Tigran saw the rise of his empire, he also bore witness to its fall at the hands of Rome, the same Rome who would kill his loyal son, Artavasdes, and plunge Armenia into chaos. When the dust settled, there was but one Artaxide left, the standalone queen in Armenian history, Aratu. And just as she stood alone, so too does the history of the Armenians, all the way to the present day. The last Ptolemy, Drusilla, was born in 38 AD in her father's northwestern kingdom of Mauritania. She was named after her sister and the late sister of the Roman Emperor Caligula. Her father's name was Ptolemy, and he was a loyal vassal king to the quickly expanding Roman Empire. Drusilla would be the only child of King Ptolemy and his wife Julia Urania. They likely would have had more children, but Drusilla's infant life took a drastic turn for the worst when she was only 2. Her father would be assassinated after being invited to Rome by Emperor Caligula in 40 AD. Drusilla should have succeeded Ptolemy as queen, but the kingdom of Mauritania was annexed by the Roman Empire following the assassination. Drusilla's saving grace came at the beginning of 41 AD. Her father's childhood friend and first cousin, Claudius, would be crowned as the new Roman emperor after the murder of Caligula and a massacre of the ruling Julio-Claudian dynasty. Claudius decided to take in the daughter of the man he had grown up with and raise her in the imperial court. It seemed a Roman tradition to keep the descendants of Cleopatra closer than even enemies. They were a threat after all, even this 3-year-old was. The Ptolemies were simply too well known and too ancient to not hold respect, even if her bloodline had been diluted by 3 generations of outside of the family marriages. Drusilla grew up in Rome as her father and grandmother had, and lived as normal life as someone in her circumstances could. At the age of only 17, Emperor Claudius decided to get rid of the Ptolemaic dynasty, hopefully for good this time. There was 2 ways that this could be achieved, and only one was painless. Kill her, the daughter of the man you grew up with, or marry her off to a noble that hopefully wouldn't use the power of the Ptolemaic dynasty against Rome. Claudius had thought that he had found the man for the job, and another. In 53 AD, Drusilla married a man named Antonius Felix, who was then sent to govern the province of Judea alongside his newlywed wife. Marcus Antonius Felix was of Greek descent and was himself descended from ancient kings. In Judea, her new husband didn't seem to be the man that Claudius thought him to be. He accepted bribes, corrupted the government, and looked the other way at open rebellions. After only a year of marriage, he also began looking for a new wife. He found one in the daughter of King Herod. Her name was also Drusilla, which makes the situation all the worse for our Drusilla Ptolemy. After divorcing Drusilla Ptolemy, he sent her back to the Roman court, which is a bit surprising, but I guess if you're governing Judea, you might want a connection to King Herod for simple legitimacy, not some queen of a dynasty that hadn't ruled in Judea for over a century. Shortly after returning to Rome, Emperor Claudius would die, and the infamous Emperor Nero would succeed him. Like Caligula, Nero wasn't terrible for the first months of his reign. He was only a boy, and much of the real power rested in the hands of his mother and his tutor, a man that you may know as Seneca. After spending 2 more years in Rome, Drusilla would again be married off, not to a mere Roman noble this time, but to an actual king. Well, a priest king at that. Before mentioning the name of this priest king, I need to mention his relation to Drusilla, the daughter of King Herod. The priest king's older brother and the former priest king was once married to her, making them ex-in-laws. Although an arranged marriage, it seemed like Drusilla Ptolemy was getting some form of revenge on her Herodian counterpart. The priest king that she was set to marry was a distant cousin of the Ptolemies, a man named Sohemus, the ruler of Emesa, a kingdom located largely in modern-day interior Syria. Emesa was one of the many client vassal kings under the overall control of the Roman Empire. His descent has been disputed, with some claiming him to be a Phoenician, while other sources may prove him to be of Arab origin. Now that we know what Sohemus was a king of, we can ask what he was a priest of. The answer is simple: the sun. King Sohemus was a priest of a cult that worshipped the sun by venerating a large black meteorite that had fallen near the city of Emesa. They called their sun Elagabalus, which translated to Lord of the Mountain, and worshipped him as their singular solar deity. Drusilla was now the Sun Queen of Syria, in contrast to her grandmother, who had been the Moon Queen of Mauritania. On top of being the priestly ruler of Emesa, Rome entrusted Sohemus enough to also give him ownership of Sophene, a majority Armenian and Kurdish kingdom on the edge of the empire. This he governed well, along with Emesa. In under a year of marriage, the couple welcomed their one and only known son, who would take the name of Gaius Julius Alexion. The first part of his name is obviously a nod to his distant relative, Gaius Julius Caesar. The last part of his name is also a nod, but not as noticeable at first. Alexion is a spin on the name Alexander, which happened to be the name of a previous priest king of Emesa, as well as his possible, very distant relative, Alexander the Great. King Sohemus, like Drusilla's father had been, was the definition of a loyal client king, not once disobeying the orders of Rome. He was even loyal to the new Flavian dynasty when they came to rule the Roman Empire after the suicide of Emperor Nero in the subsequent year of the Four Emperors. Drusilla and her priestly king prospered under the rule of Rome for 15 years. So too did the religion of Elagabalus, which slowly began to spread across the empire. In 73 AD, King Sohemus would die, likely of natural causes, and he would be succeeded by his son that he had with Queen Drusilla, Gaius Julius Alexion. At the age of only 17, this newly crowned teenager was the king and cult leader of Emesa. In this transitional period, Drusilla Ptolemy likely assisted her son in managing Emesa and settled him down into his role. Drusilla outlived her second husband by 6 years, and so it is, in 79 AD, that the last person who could claim to be part of the main branch of the nearly 400-year-old Ptolemaic dynasty died of unknown causes at the age of only 41. The sun had now set yet again on the Ptolemaic dynasty, but as always, it would one day rise. As for her son, priest king Gaius Julius Alexion, he would rule as priest king until his death in 78 AD, at the age of only 22. He lived long enough to have a child, but after his death, Rome would formally annex their meteorite sun-worshipping client kingdom in Syria, just like they had in Mauritania. After this, the descendants of Queen Cleopatra of Egypt become increasingly hard to solidly track, although the religion of Elagabalus continued, meaning that someone had to be the leader of this sun-worshipping cult, leaving me and many other historians to assume that the line, who were once kings of Emesa, continued being the high priest of Elagabalus. As most things in history do, it finally came full circle. In the late 2nd century, more than 100 years after the death of Drusilla Ptolemy, the emperor Septimius Severus was crowned. He would marry a woman named Julia Domna. She was the daughter of the high priest of Elagabalus and the possible descendant of Drusilla, Julius Bassianus. Together, Septimius Severus and Julia Domna had 2 children, named Geta and Caracalla, who would rule the Roman Empire together briefly until Caracalla murdered his brother. Caracalla in turn would be murdered himself. However, the cousin of Caracalla would reclaim the seat of emperor after only a year. He was only a 14-year-old boy, but he was also the new high priest of Emesa. He would be known to all Romans as Emperor Elagabalus, taking the name of his god and even taking the black meteorite of Emesa with him to Rome. Elagabalus is widely considered the worst of all Roman emperors, and his cousin that succeeded him, Severus Alexander, did not fare much better. After his death is when historians start to signify the beginning of the crisis of the 3rd century. So there it is, The Ptolemaic dynasty and Cleopatra's descendants may have just gotten their revenge by inadvertently ruining the empire that had ended their dynastic rule. The Ptolemies are often forgotten past Cleopatra and certainly past Caesarion. They were without a doubt one of the classical age's greatest dynasties, and what Rome did to them generation after generation after generation was just torture. From Egypt to Mauritania to Syria, the descendants of Cleopatra never had control over their own destinies. They were simply a tool the Romans raised in their courts, used when they wished, and tossed to the side when it benefited them. (1447) Seville. A 23-year-old noble girl watches as her father and brother prepare to board a ship. Her father, Hernan Peraza, had inherited and bought all of the Canary Islands, conquered or not. Her brother Guillaume was eager to fight, hoping to have songs praising his victories. The girl wishes them both goodbye and waves as their boats become specks on the Atlantic horizon. One of these men she would be reunited with, the other would be dead within the year. This is the story of Inez Peraza, the self-proclaimed queen of the Canary Islands. Inez Peraza was born in 1424 in the city of Seville, which at that time was part of the Kingdom of Castile. She was named after her mother, Inez de las Casas. In 1391, her maternal grandfather, Juan de las Casas, becomes the first of many of her family to venture to the Canary Islands. It is through him that the claim to the unconquered islands of La Gomera, La Palma, Gran Canaria, and Tenerife are passed on to her brother, Guillaume Peraza. Her father, Hernan, would eventually sell his land in Castile for the ownership of the already conquered islands of Algeria, Fuerteventura, and Lanzarote. His obsession with the Canaries would lead to the 1447 expedition that he would take with his son Guillaume. Hernan would set up his base on the island of Fuerteventura, while the young Guillaume Peraza would make an attempt at conquering the island of La Palma. After making a successful landing, Guillaume and his would-be conquistadors trek further into the island. Eventually, his small force is ambushed and Guillaume is hit in the head with a rock, dying instantly. Songs would still be sung about Guillaume, but not the triumphant ones that he had hoped for. The poem, Laments to the Death of Guillaume Peraza, is still widely known throughout the Canaries to this present day. Hernan Peraza had lost his only son, and nearly lost his claim to the unconquered islands, if not for his last remaining child, Inez Peraza. A few months after the death of her brother, Inez Peraza is married to a Spanish nobleman named Diego Garcia de Herrera. Shortly after this marriage, the couple are shipped off to join her father as he continues in his Canarian obsession. Hernan Peraza would manage to consolidate his rule in Algeria and found a city on La Gomera to contest the Portuguese trading fort on the north side of that island. In 1450 and 1452, Portuguese and their Guanche allies would attack Peraza on La Gomera. These small-scale battles would be wholly inconclusive and amount to little more than needless bloodshed. Eventually, this small-scale war over La Gomera would bleed out into the Atlantic Ocean. In 1452, a naval battle between two ships would take place, one being under the flag of Portugal, the other Castile. The Portuguese would capture the Castilian ship, taking their sailors and treasure back to Portugal in what seemed to be an act of piracy. The Canary Islands was making both countries froth at the mouth. Neither would let the other have them without at least a fight. The main financer for Portugal's Canarian expeditions was probably one of the most famous Portuguese men to never become king. You know him best as Prince Henry the Navigator. Like Hernan Peraza, Prince Henry had a small obsession with the islands. For him, they would act as a vital outpost to explore more of the oceans that surrounded the African continent. In late 1452, the Castilian lord of the Canary Islands, Hernan Peraza, would die at the age of 62, leaving his lordship to his only living child, Inez Peraza, who is now the Lady of the Canary Islands. Along with her husband, Diego Garcia de Herrera, the couple would rule over the four islands from La Gomera. This title of lady did not suit Inez Peraza, however. In her own letters, she would address herself as Queen of the Canary Islands. which yeah, that definitely has more of a ring to it. Although she would never proclaim herself as an independent queen, but one under the lordship of Castile. 2 years later in 1454, the Portuguese hold over La Gomera was broken, and Prince Henry the Navigator was forced to abandon his claims over the Canaries. The Guanche on La Gomera, unlike on the other islands, would not so much be conquered as they would come to an agreement with Queen Peraza over her lordship of the islands. This is really the only exception to the otherwise brutal conquest of these islands, but it wouldn't even last forever. For 12 years, the Peraza-Herrera hold over the islands would continue, although with occasional Guanche revolts that would be viciously put down. Over those 12 years, the Peraza-Herrera family would grow. In all, the couple would have 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. In 1476, the first island to be conquered, Lanzarote, would rise up in a rebellion. But it wasn't the native Guanche this time. Instead, it was the Europeans on the island. The people on Lanzarote were apparently fed up with the Queen's governance. They petitioned for Queen Isabella of Castile, asking her to become the ruler of Lanzarote. The rebels continued, even as Queen Peraza sent her husband to execute and exile their ringleaders. The Lanzarote uprising did not go unnoticed in Spain. Queen Isabella sent a private investigator to the island to observe the rebellion and punch holes in Queen Peraza's lordship over the Canaries. By October of 1477, this private investigator manages to come to an agreement that Queen Isabella would be proud of. Likely with a good deal of threats, Queen Inez Peraza agrees to give up her family's claims to the unconquered islands of La Palma, Gran Canaria, and Tenerife, therefore giving the rights to conquer the islands directly to the Castilian crown. In that same year, Queen Peraza would start to divide her islands among her children. To her eldest, Pedro, she granted Algeria, while La Gomera went to her second-born, named after her father, Hernan Peraza the Younger. This Hernan Peraza, much like his namesake, was very protective and borderline obsessed with his island. After an incident in 1481 that would see a Castilian captain dead on the orders of Hernan the Younger, the Lord of La Gomera would be forced back to Spain to explain his rash actions. By this time, Isabella of Castile had married Ferdinand II of Aragon, and the two kingdoms were now as one, being called the Kingdom of Spain. He pleaded for their forgiveness and was granted that, under one condition. He was to take the spot of the captain that he had killed in the conquest of the island of Gran Canaria. The conquest had already began in 1478. Hernan Peraza the Younger did his part in assisting the Castilian commanders on the island. Namely, the younger Peraza would meet Alonso Fernandez de Lugo, future conqueror of the remaining Canaries, for the first time. The conquest of Gran Canaria would be completed in 1483, and Hernan Peraza the Younger was allowed to return to La Gomera. Not only was he now the Lord of La Gomera, but for the past year, he was also granted lordship over his brother's island of El Hierro. In 1482, the eldest of Inez Peraza's children, Pedro, attempted to assassinate his parents. This plot would fail and would only result in the title of Lord being stripped away from him and his exile to Spain. 4 years later, in 1486, Hernan Peraza the Younger would become besieged in the fort that Hernan Peraza the Elder had built on La Gomera. The Guanche on the island, which, might I remind you, were subjugated mostly in a peaceful manner, rose up against the harsh treatment of the Perazas. Their numbers were still largely intact, and Hernan Peraza could do nothing as his position became more dire day by day in his fort. Eventually, he managed to get a letter out to the governor of Gran Canaria. He arrived to relieve the Perazas and defeated the Guanche, enslaving many of them and reversing the mostly peaceful subjugation of La Gomera. They were not finished, however. The Guanche continued to resist, delving deeper inland and gathering their strength. They rallied around a man named Hatacaperche. He had a personal reason to hate Hernan Peraza, as he was having an affair with one of Hatacaperche's cousins. His grudge was personal, so Hatacaperche met him personally. In 1488, the Guanche warrior waited for Hernan Peraza as he exited his fort. He made his intentions clear, brandishing a long wooden spear, and after a quick verbal exchange, Hatacaperche throws his projectile with pinpoint accuracy into Peraza. He would die of his wounds, and his islands would be passed on to his wife. The widowed lady of El Hierro and La Gomera Beatrice. Much to the dismay of the other Lady of the Canaries, she continued governing the islands following her husband's death, as she would become the regent for their 8-year-old son. 1492 is for the most part remembered as the year that Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas, but he was not the only Spanish-sponsored mission in that year. On top of Columbus, Isabella and Ferdinand also gave permission to conquer the island of La Palma to Alonso Fernandez de Lugo, the same man that had helped in the conquest of Gran Canaria. Both Columbus and de Lugo left Spain, both in the direction of the Canary Islands. For Columbus, he landed on La Gomera, which was still under the regency of Beatrice. This was his last stop before sailing into the unknown. He only planned to stay a few days. Perhaps out of fear or love for La Gomera, he would end up staying on the island for a month. But if I had to guess, it was probably due to fear. If this doesn't signify the Canary Islands as being the stepping stone from old to new worlds, then I'm not sure what does. On his third voyage west, Columbus would stop at La Gomera again. For de Lugo, he was going to La Palma, the island that Guillaume Peraza and so many others had died trying to capture. Isabella and Ferdinand offered de Lugo 700,000 gold pieces if he could conquer La Palma within the space of a year from landing. He set out to do just that, and on September 29th of 1492, he landed on the island. The race was on. At first, the conquest was a simple alliance spree with the Guanche on the coast, but as they ventured further inland, the hilly, rough terrain gave way to hundreds of Guanche, ready to defend La Palma. They were led by a chief named Tanasu. He controlled a mountain pass that was more than defensible. After months of siege and defeats at the hands of Tanasu, de Lugo starts to fear that he will not receive his year-end bonus. That would just be a tragedy. So he does what conquistadors do best: lie. In the late summer, he invites Tanasu to a meeting that was supposed to discuss peace. Instead, they capture the chief and send him back to Spain. After months of siege on La Palma, the chief was already malnourished. Before arriving on Spanish shores, Tanasu would die of starvation. Alonso Fernandez de Lugo was granted his 700,000 gold piece bonus, conquering La Palma in under a year's time. Now, only one island remained, Tenerife, and it was the largest and most populated of all. We will cover this final conquest very soon, but for now, let's fast forward a little bit to catch up with Queen Inez Peraza. She had remained in the Canaries this whole time, still governing Lanzarote and Fuerteventura. Her husband, Diego Garcia de Herrera, had died some years ago. In 1502, the 78-year-old Queen Inez knew that she was soon to follow. Making sure to be completely equal this time around, she split the land on her remaining islands between her 3 children that weren't dead and didn't try to kill her. Sancho, Constanza, and Maria continue to govern in her place. This being settled, the queen left her kingdom to end her story where it had started. She made it back to Seville by 1503, and the 79-year-old Inez would die within the year. The life of Queen Inez Peraza is in many ways a tragedy. From her brother's early death to her father's obsession with the islands that had killed him, and all the way to the betrayal of one of her sons and another's death. The legacy of this tragic life would live on through her grandchildren, through her son, Hernan Peraza. Hernan, named after his grandfather, would in turn name his 2 children as Hernan Peraza the Elder had. The boy would be named Guillaume, and he would govern La Gomera and El Hierro, while his daughter, Inez, would marry the son of Alonso Fernandez de Lugo, and together, the couple would come to govern the island of La Palma and Tenerife. What's that thing they always say about history rhyming? In the wake of the unexpected and early death of King Pratap Singh Shah in 1777, a power vacuum would be opened in the recently created Kingdom of Nepal. A power vacuum that would be filled by controversial regents, court politics, and war. Succeeding Pratap Singh Shah as the third king of Nepal was his 2-year-old son, Rana Bahadur Shah. A long regency of 17 years would need to be put in place until the infant king came of age. The first regent of the young Rana Bahadur Shah was his mother, a woman named Rahendra Laxmi. Rahendra was a princess from the kingdom of Palpa and had married Pratap Singh Shah when they were both in their teenage years, securing an alliance between Nepal and Palpa. At the funeral of Pratap Shah, Queen Rahendra was expected to throw herself in the fires of her husband's funeral pyre, as the Hindu custom of sati required. She, however, did nothing of the sort, and instead started acting as the queen regent for her son. Not following through with sati was enough to gain Rahendra enemies. Becoming a regent was enough for everyone to despise her. Rahendra knew this, and to ensure her regency, she invited the brother of Pratap Singh Shah back from his exile, Bahadur Shah. Bahadur Shah was the youngest son of the founder of Nepal, Prithvi Narayan Shah. He was exiled by his brother King Pratap due to his popularity among the Nepali people. With his invitation back to Nepal, Rahendra named him as co-regent. The compliance of the joint regions didn't last long before rival factions emerged behind both of them. The emerging groups can be simply explained as the war and peace factions. Rahendra led the peace faction, as she wanted to wait for Rana Bahadur Shah to come of age so he could make the decision to continue the expansion of Nepal. Prince Regent Bahadur Shah wished to resume the unification campaign started by his father. Rahendra, citing that starting a war was out of the jurisdiction of their regency, put Bahadur Shah on house arrest. Eventually, the Queen Regent relented and lifted the house arrest, releasing Bahadur, who promptly put Rahendra on house arrest. His loyal soldiers taking the Queen Regent to her house in handcuffs made of silver, something befitting a princess of Palpa. With the position of Bahadur Shah secured, he intended to give the Gorkhali nobles exactly what they wanted: war. After making preparations, Bahadur Shah declared war on the Chhabsi Confederacy to the west. The Chhabsi Confederacy was an alliance formed by mostly small city-states that intended on halting the expansion of the land-hungry Kingdom of Nepal. In 1779, the Prince Regent began his invasion at the head of an army. Before any deciding military encounter could occur, Rahendra broke free of her house arrest and retook control over Kathmandu and her son. With the regency now contested, Bahadur Shah was forced into one of two hard decisions. He could turn his army around and march on Kathmandu, re-imprison Rahendra, and probably even take the Nepali throne if he wished. He was popular enough after all. Or he could simply walk away and end this regency war before it had begun. He chose the latter option, exiling himself to India. With Rahendra's regency secured, so too was peace restored. The court intrigue did not end, however, as the war faction was still hungry for conquest. But with Bahadur's absence, they could rally behind no one. This peace lasted for 3 years until Rahendra was forced into the very thing she wanted so badly to avoid. In January of 1782, the Chhabsi Confederation launched a surprise attack on Nepal. Declaring war was one thing, but a defensive war was something Rahendra could get behind, if not for the safety of the young king. Many of the Gorkhali nobles, who were once her enemies at court, quickly pushed their differences aside to defend Nepal, but some of the generals refused to participate in the war. Rahendra, in desperation for good generalship, invited someone back from exile. No, not Prince Bahadur Shah. She instead chose to invite someone else that her late husband had exiled, the controversial Swarup Singh. Swarup was a court singer that quickly became the closest advisor and general of King Pratap Singh Shah, but before his untimely death he exiled Swarup based on the controversy always surrounding him. The only requirement Rahendra gave for Swarup's return was that he had to put down his rivalry with Vamsharaj Pandey, a prominent Gorkhali general that Swarup had shared a grudge with for several years. The two men eventually put their differences aside for the mutual defense of Nepal. Swarup, Vamsharaj, and other Nepali generals proceeded in crushing the Chhabsi Confederacy in under a year. Seeking to put an end to their coalition, Rahendra annexes around half of the Chhabsi kingdoms into Nepal. Following the end of this short and successful defensive war that turned into a conquest, Rahendra follows suit in her promise of peace until her son comes of age. After the end of the war, the much-hated Swarup Singh returned to the royal court. his controversies following him as they always had. One particular case in 1785 would see Swaroop Singh play a leading part in condemning his rival, Vamsharaj Pandey, to death. Vamsharaj was brought up on charges of military misconduct when he allowed for one of the kings of the Chopsy Confederacy to run away from a battle without him pursuing the retreating army. Swaroop gave a long and fiery testimony which secured the execution of his rival. Shortly after the execution, Queen Regent Rahendra became ill with the same disease that had killed her husband, the scarlet fever of tuberculosis. The disease also took her life soon after she contracted it, dying in 1785, while her orphaned son was only 10. A regent would still be needed for the king for another 9 years. Queen Rahendra is often misremembered as something of a villain in the story of the unification of Nepal, as she halted the endless wars of the Gorkha. Her position on peace was something Nepal hadn't enjoyed for decades, and allowed for the newly created kingdom to stabilize. She still did ultimately contribute to the unification by annexing a series of Chopsy kingdoms in a defensive war. If Rahendra should be remembered in any way, then it should be in good contrast to the warmongering nobles at the Nepali court.
If you want to support this stoic historian, feel free to do so on Patreon for as little as $1 a month and join Derek Clark, Savak Leo Nazarian, Taj Guilford, Nick Mate Voisian, Lazarus Dykos, and Dave J. Or become a YouTube channel member like Derek Clark again and Donald Vincent. Thanks again for supporting the channel and a warm welcome to my brand new patrons. I really appreciate you guys.